All right. I never know if these are on or not. I think, can you hear me? All right. Yeah. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming today. I'm Marianne Ryan, Dean of Libraries, and it's good to see so many of you and to welcome you to the University Library's annual Spring Alumni Authors Speaker event. I'm especially happy to welcome you to our spaces on this particular day as we are in the middle of National Library Week. Launched in 1958 and held every April, it's a celebration that highlights transformative impact libraries, librarians, and library workers have in our communities and serves as a reminder of how libraries continue to be essential to fostering education, promoting literacy, and connecting people to the resources that they need to thrive. It was the American Library Association and the American Book Publishers Council that first conceived it this week, and we're proud to be a part of it. National Library Week's theme this year is Drawn to the Library, which is a perfect fit for the panel that we have this afternoon, hence the title of the event, Drawn to the Library, Authors Who Create, featuring three of Loyola's talented alums who are comic book creators and artists, Scott Larson, Andrew Pepoy, and Stephen Titra. Their works are now part of the Alumni Authors Collection. The Alumni Authors Project was conceptualized more than a decade ago by IPS Professor Emeritus Peter Gilmore, who's in the audience, to recognize Loyola graduates who have published books. We proudly display the core Alumni Authors Collection on the first floor of the Information Commons, which you would have walked by when you came into the building. But in case you missed it, I invite you to browse the collection, which now stands at more than 1,200 books and counting. If you or anyone you know is an alum and would like to participate, please contact us at libraries.luc.edu. Reach out to me or see Jocelyn Chang, the library's community relations and communication coordinator, who is right there. Speaking of Jocelyn, who was instrumental in planning today's event with our co-sponsor, Alumni Relations, I'll now hand off the mic to her to moderate our panel. Over to you, Jocelyn. Thank you, everyone, and thank you all.
This will be easy because I'm just going to name and pass on to our first speaker. We have three wonderful and creative artists and comic book artists. So I believe Andrew will begin first, and then we'll have Scott, and then we'll have Stephen, who will introduce themselves and their background. So thank you so much. So we will begin with Andrew.
Hey there, I'm Andrew Pepoy. I'm here because, as they said, it's the theme of National Library Week this year is Drawn to the Library, and it's all about comics and graphic novels, and hopefully encouraging everyone to read those kinds of books. And I'm probably best known for Fables, The Simpsons, Archie Comics, and my own creation, The Adventures of Simone and Ajax. I graduated from Loyola back in 1991, but I started my professional career actually while I was still here in 1989. And since that time, I don't have an exact number, but I estimate I've done somewhere between 15 and 20,000 pages. And for a wide variety of comics. My mom says I was always into drawing, always into comics, even as a little kid. But it was, I remember being really into like reruns of the Batman TV show after school when I was a kid, or, when I was a kid, the Wonder Woman TV show with Linda Carter was on TV. But what really got me into reading comics was Peanuts. We all know Peanuts. And Charles Schultz and just just all those wonderful characters. What spurred me to actually start wanting to make my own was Superman the movie, which came out when I was in 4th grade. I remember I was sick for a while. I was stuck at home, and Mom went to the grocery store, where they had little bags of 3 Superman comic books for $1. So you can tell we're talking about the 1970s from that price. And I loved it. And so she got me another bag of Superman comics, which I also loved. And once I got better, I started going out to the little mini mart down the street in Holland, Michigan, where I grew up, and picking up more for myself. And I soon started drawing all of my favorite characters, and decided in 4th grade that I was going to be a comic book artist. And despite whatever anyone threw at me or discouraged me or anything like that, well, here I am, 45 years later or something, and still wanting to do comics. So I've been very, very lucky that I was able to figure out what I wanted to do in an early age and did it. So when I started making my own comics, my own finished, published little Xerox fanzines when I was about 12 years old. I took a summer art class in Grand Rapids from a real comic book artist at the time, and one of the class assignment was to draw the first 3 pages of your comic book. And this is a little thing I find sort of interesting because it ties all the way from back then to today, which is there was another kid in my class. I was 12, he was 10. His name was Tom Nagovin. And he said to me, I'm going to throw a comic book convention in my garage. And if you finish that and print it, I will buy 25 copies from you and sell it at my comic book convention. That was probably the first example of Tom making art happen. And Tom, who is also a Chicago native, or I shouldn't say Chicago native, was a Western Michigan native who also ended up in Chicago for a long, long time and is back again. Ended up as you might say, a guy who makes art happen. And his latest project was touring the world with Malcolm McDowell and doing a restoration of the movie Caligula. So some of these things, you never know who you're going to meet along the way, where it's going to, and who's going to help you make your dream happen. And so Tom, at 10, helped make my 12-year-old dream happen. And from that point on, I started making tons of my own fanzines. You see this one, Saga, that was done in my freshman year of high school. My lousy art there with a coffee stain on it. Oh, and I do hope you'll excuse some of the horrible scans of these images because I don't have all this stuff at hand. I had to go on the internet to find a lot of this stuff and find what other people had posted. So there's this foundation here that had scanned a lot of my old fanzines. So anyway, I started doing those when I was 12. The Wonders of Nuclear War I had to share because that was my final fanzine and the only one I did while I was here at Loyola. A nice anti-nuclear war, anti-Ronald Reagan comic done in 1987. But anyway, I did these through high school and into my days at Loyola. How did I end up at Loyola? Well, I looked at a lot of schools. I got accepted to all 3 that I applied to, Loyola, Xavier, and University of Michigan. I think my parents probably would have preferred I went to Xavier because they offered me a lot more scholarship money. But I ended up here because at Loyola, unlike a lot of other schools like the University of Michigan, I could have the full academic curriculum. And so I could come here and I could take physics and still be an art major. I could come here and still take philosophy, and I ended up minoring in history. When I came here to check out the campus, the head of the art department didn't think much of comics, and told me they would teach me about real art. And so my mom was convinced I was not going to come here. But, based on that. But I did come here, and there were other teachers, fortunately, who did support the comics, did support my dream of wanting to do comics. But I sort of look at when you pick a school, you're also picking where you're going to be living. And part of the reason I ended up here was because it's Chicago. And I was very much into music, and Chicago has a wonderful music scene. And this may sound like a strange reason to pick a school, but one of the things that contributed to it was, at the time, just around the corner over on Devon, was what I considered to be the greatest comic shop to have ever existed. And I wanted to be near that. And in many ways, having access to this amazing world of comics, because they carried everything. So it wasn't just, I was here I was at Loyola being exposed to, like I said, physics, philosophy, history, over at that shop, which was right around the corner. So you might say an extension of being here. I was exposed to so many kinds of comics and comic strips and from around the world that nobody else in the US had. This shop was importing them directly for their shop. So, it may sound like a strange reason, but it was a contributing factor. I started working professionally in comics while I was here. This was my first professional comic sale, which I did the summer between my sophomore and junior year of college. Sorry about the lousy scan. Again, it was pulled off the internet. It was just a little one-pager, but I got paid for it, and it was in a professional book, and a lot of the other people who also in that book went on to big careers in comics. So, I'll call that a real professional job. And let's see. But while I was here, I started something that I'm still working on today. This is a page from the Adventures of Simone and Ajax, which I did for Cadence magazine. Does Cadence still exist? No? It was a Loyola arts magazine that was published back when I was here in those ancient days of the late 80s and early 90s. And I drew this little 3-page strip. I had created these characters in doodles while I was in my classes here. Ajax was actually part of a painting that I did in my art class where it was supposed to be a variety of photographic elements combined into one big watercolor painting. And it was missing something. And I was often one to break the rules on these assignments to make something work. And it seemed to be missing something. And so I painted this little tiny green dinosaur off into the corner of it. And it just made the painting. So Ajax stuck around in my doodles. And Simone was inspired during the most boring class I took, statistics. And I had a big crush on the girl sitting next to me in class. And so she inspired me to draw Simone. I actually did end up, I don't know if she ever saw it because I don't know what ever happened to her, but I did end up thanking her in one of my books for helping inspire Simone. I'm skipping ahead on myself a little bit here, but, but 35 years later, I'm still working on Simone and Ajax. And that started while I was here. Oops, that's not what I'm getting to. Went to the Rome campus, came back way too artsy and pretentious for my own good, and was showing my stuff around at comic book conventions when I came back after that summer, and was being told by a lot of the publishers, the artsy publishers, that my stuff was too commercial, and the commercial publishers told me my stuff was too weird. So wasn't getting anywhere. And someone said, "Why don't you try inking?" Well, you're probably like, "What's inking?" Comic books for many, many years would have a separate pencil artist and an ink artist. It was more something that was done for getting things cranked out fast because comics had to come out on a monthly basis. So you'd have someone, as you can see on the left side, someone pencils a page, and then somebody else, on this example, this is a page from DC Comics Fables. I would go in with brushes, pens, and actual black ink, right on, in many cases, right on top of the actual pencils, and go in and finish it. Because usually the pencils were a little rough and unfinished. Bucky's stuff, Mark Buckingham, the penciler on this, his stuff was a little tighter than some, but we would go in, and mine would be the line that would get printed. As you can see on this example, I'm not given a whole lot to work with. And my job is to enhance and bring out the best in that penciler. And that's something, what my approach to inking was a little different than a lot of other people's approach. A lot of other people would feel like they needed to imprint their look, their style on someone else's work. For me, I always looked at inking as my job was to adapt my style to bring out the best in a penciler, whatever their style was. And that allowed me in many ways to have a wide variety, work on a wide variety of stuff. As you saw, that was sort of a fantasy thing on the page before. I got to do more of a humor thing on this page. I got to work with, on this one, you can see I'm given very, very little to work with and have to really bring out a lot more of the atmosphere. Like this would almost be called, when it gets to this level, you're given that little pencil, that little on the penciling, and you're doing that much work with the inks, it's called finishing. And this page, I was really happy to get to work on this. This, I got to ink Steve Ditko. Do you know who Steve Ditko is? Steve was one of the 3 architects of the Marvel Universe. Stan Lee, who takes all the credit for it, but really didn't do all of it. Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko were like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were the two main artists. Steve is the co-creator of Spider-Man and the sole creator of Doctor Strange and many other things over the years. And I was very lucky to get to actually ink Steve on these pages shortly before he died. I got to work on Futurama. I know there's a lot of Futurama fans out there, but you can see what I'm given as far as pencils go on some of these things and what my job was as an inker. And that was my primary job in comics for about 25 years, was inking other people's pencils. I wanted to draw comics, but my style and what I wanted to do in comics wasn't always fitting. So I often kept something going on in the background that I would work on, of my own, like Simone and Ajax. But I made my living inking Marvel, DC, and various other comics. So these are just a few examples of pencils by other people versus inks. And again, talking about adapting, most of those others, I know from my brushwork. I love doing fancy brushwork. But say like on this one, this was done for a French comic called L'Enfust. And this was almost entirely pen because again, I'm trying to bring out the best in his and it called for that. This one was a lot of fun. This is Alan Weiss, who lives here in Chicago. He's been around doing comics since the 70s. And on this, I got to throw every technique in the world at it. And this was just a lot of fun. So I always throw this page in whenever I'm talking about my stuff because this is one of my favorite inking jobs I ever did because I got to use every technique out there. So anyway, like I said, I came back, wasn't getting anywhere with my stuff. Someone said, do you want to try inking? And I was like, sure, I'll give it a shot. And I was very lucky. I landed there were two people there that same day who said, well, you want to try inking? This was at the 1990 Chicago Comic-Con. And one was a publisher, one was an artist named Tim Eldred, who I grew up near in Michigan, who was doing a series. And he's like, we need an inker for mine. And back in those days, you could just fly out to San Diego Comic-Con and walk in, with a ticket. And I got this job inking Tim, who I'd known back in my middle school and high school days, on a series called Alienation. So these are examples of my very first inking job. But not being, wanting to keep pushing for stuff. This was my first big professional job, which I landed while I was still here at Loyola. I went to New York on my spring break. Had never been to New York before in my life, but with a few friends of friends and contacts, I was able to go up to Marvel and DC Comics and was literally standing in the hallway at DC Comics at the right moment when an editor came out of his office, asked me what I was standing doing there. I told him, he took pity on me, looked at my portfolio, and gave me the Flash Annual to do. And I actually ended up using some of my work for the Flash Annual in my senior show here at Loyola, which landed me a C from that same person, that same teacher who didn't approve of me doing comics in the first place when I first came here. Fortunately, the other two, you had to be judged by 3 teachers, and the other 2 both gave me an A, so it balanced out a little better. But yeah, so while I was at Loyola, by the time I graduated from Loyola, I was working for both DC and Marvel Comics. And I spent much of the 90s working for them and other publishers on various superhero and things like that. So again, these are things that I inked, not penciled, for various comics. Everyone knows Daredevil, everyone knows Doctor Strange, Green Lantern, Justice League, The Punisher and Spider-Man, Batman and Robin, X-Men, Aliens. So I was doing a lot of stuff. But like I said, while I was doing these things, I was trying to keep doing my own kind of thing at the same time. So I was doing Simone and Ajax as a black and white feature in a variety of anthologies in the 90s. This is a cover from the one-shot I did with them, their solo book. And so again, brought them back, did a lot of stories with them, had some fun with it for a while, and starting to do more cartoony stuff with them led to me doing more cartoony work on cartoony comics. Because like I said, I was mostly doing superheroes, and someone said, oh, I forgot I have examples of the black and white Simone and Ajax stuff from the 90s. So yeah. Ajax, tough private eye character in this. The fun thing about Simone and Ajax, it's a woman, it's like a woman and her best pal, not her pet. Her best pal who happens to be a 3-foot tall cartoony dinosaur. And I can send them at any time or place I feel like sending them. So, you can see from this, like they're riding a little flying horse. Simone goes to Valkyrie school. She's a little barbarian type where they go and battle dragons, or they get menaced by a giant mutant fish, or, they become Private Eyes. And Ajax is a real tough-looking private eye in his little fedora there with his root beer. Or they go to outer space. Why not? That's the fun thing about comics, is comics, you can, on a low budget, you can take your characters and your things to any world and any time or place you want them to. And that's what I love. One of the things I love about making the comics is I can, sure, I do a lot of commercial type stuff that I get paid for to pay the bills, but I also sometimes actually get paid for doing my own stuff. But yeah, like I said, the cartoony stuff led to me working on a lot more cartoony comics. So I got to work on Sonic and Knuckles, or Scooby-Doo. I did Sonic and Knuckles for 15 years. I did Scooby-Doo for 10. Not, at the same time as each other, obviously not in a row. But also tying into Chicago, one day I heard the artist from Little Orphan Annie was retiring, which was a strip that the Tribune Syndicate owned. And so I made some phone calls and went down there hoping to sell them a Simone and Ajax strip. That was my main reason for trying out for Annie. I didn't think they'd actually give me the job. But they did. And so everyone knows Little Orphan Annie, and the movie Annie. And I did a redesign. I did the first ever redesign of Little Orphan Annie, gave her a slightly more modern haircut, sent her off on grand adventures, and had it, and did that for about a year. Just as Annie was wrapping up, I was lucky enough to be introduced to the people who do The Simpsons at a convention, again, here in Chicago, which led to me working on The Simpsons for 18 years. That was one of my favorite jobs I ever got to work on. Now you're thinking, oh, what was Matt Feazell? Not Matt Feazell. What was Matt Groening like? I rarely ever met Matt. And usually when I met Matt, he had to be reminded who I was. I'd see him maybe once every 2-3 years. And, but Matt believed in a really good working relationship with his artists. So it was a great situation. They treated you well. They paid you decently. No, you did not get rich doing this. You were one of hundreds of people working on The Simpsons. Matt cannot pay everyone $1 million, but he at least paid a decent living wage. But yeah, I always had fun working on the Treehouse of Horror comics. That was always the highlight of every year, was getting to work on the Treehouse of Horror comics. And afterwards, if you want, you can come up and check. Abrams Books just published a 3-volume hardcover set collecting all of the Treehouse of Horror comics that were ever done, including the one that we won the Eisner Award for. If you don't know what the Eisner Award is, I'm very lucky to have won one. It is kind of like the Oscar of comics. I sort of look at it as I was just lucky enough to be the inker on it. I'm probably the only person who voted for it because of who inked it. But hey, I can always slap on all my promotional material. I swear, which once in a while opens a door. But yes, for them, I also worked on Futurama for about 10 years. That was a lot of fun. This is my favorite Futurama cover I ever did. It was like a steampunk issue. And around 2007, or maybe earlier, maybe 2005, I was asked, would I want to bring back Katie Keene? I had been doing Sonic the Hedgehog was published by Archie Comics, so I knew the Archie people, and they were like, would you want to do Katie Keene? They owned the character. The only thing I knew about Katie Keene was it was my mom's favorite character, so I had to try. But I also had the pressure of I had to do it right, or my mom and my aunt would both kill me. So anyway, so I managed. So I wrote and drew a revival for a while of Katie Keene. Katie was an actress, model, singer. I added the singer part. So I did that for a while, and that one was my first really professional writing credit. I actually wrote the series as well. I mean, I've been writing Simone and Ajax for years, but this was my first sort of, you might say, paid writing. And this was one of my favorite pages I did with them with this. And apparently Katy Perry based one of her outfits on that outfit and put this up on Instagram one time. Failed to mention my name, but she apparently liked the art. But just as Katie Keene was wrapping up, someone said, do you want to bring Simone and Ajax back? Now, I'd only done them in black and white. Now, I got to do them in color, and this time I got paid for them. And so, like, out of everything I've worked on, I, of course, love my own creation the best. There's nothing I'd rather work on than these guys. And so I was able to bring back Simone and Ajax, this time now in full color. And again, they can go anywhere. Jungle Adventure, menaced by giant tiki monsters. Again, bringing back the private eye thing, battling a pope, not the pope, but just a guy from Avignon who just thought he was the pope and decided he was going to go run around and do that. They saved Christmas. And I got to do that for a while, but again, that lasted just a few years. Went back to inking comics, doing some like G.I. Joe, Fables. This time we got to mix ink with gray wash. That was a fun technique. So this was some more inking on Fables over Mark Buckingham, who was one of my favorite guys to ink. On these being from the final issue, where we got to really have some fun with some of the art. As you can see, it wasn't just, it was, we do this on paper, this isn't digital. But I also started doing a lot of covers for Archie, and a lot of weird covers. I'm known for my strange takes on some of these covers. And Archie was doing some strange stuff. So yes, there were actually 2 series of Archie versus Predator. And so this is a cover based on the Saturday Night Fever poster that I did for that. Or we had the Archie zombie comic, Afterlife with Archie. They met Transformers. Or here's one that I just did recently, where it's just a good Valentine's special, and you know, there's Betty, there's Veronica, both pining over Archie. Why we've never quite figured out, but they do. And this one was done just a couple years ago. So anyway, as Fables wrapped around 2015, Fables wrapped up. Simpsons was kind of imploding at the time. I started moving on to other things. And I was really deciding I need to push myself as an artist, not just an inker. You know, like, because I did my own things where I would write and draw, but not usually the commercial side. But this one, I was lucky to work with Michael Uslan, who's produced all the Batman movies, going back to the first Tim Burton one, on a creation of his called Dinosaurs. And this was an inking job I got to do. I'm always going to be able to say Paul and Ringo liked my art because I got to work on the official adaptation of Yellow Submarine, and I know that Paul and Ringo themselves personally had to sign off on this. So whether they knew I worked on it or not, who knows? They may not have looked at the credits, but they had to sign off on the art. And so that's one of my little points of pride after all these years. And I also got to do a lot of covers for a variety of other things in recent years. So Doctor Who, I love Doctor Who. It's my favorite TV show, has been since I was in high school. So I've been very lucky to do that. So doing some of the different doctors here. This one I got to draw all the doctors up through Jodie. These are homage covers. What I should mention is something that's very popular in comics these days is taking a classic cover and basing your cover on their cover. So this was an old Jack Kirby Fantastic Four cover I turned into a Doctor Who cover. Old Batman cover turned into a David Tennant. Green Lantern cover. And I hand-lettered the logos to match the original fonts. I did a bunch of Red Sonja covers, again, an homage to the old Coppertone ad, or just a regular one. I got to do Uncle Scrooge, always very happy to have done that. And Rocky and Bullwinkle. Just always liked this one. It was just sort of a silly one, being menaced by a rubber monster. And then this is one I just did last month for the relaunch of the first issue of Vampirella, a vampire character comic, if you don't know what that one is. But it all, you know, this was my pandemic project, this book here. Simone and Ajax had to do something, all the work dried up. So I did a Kickstarter, and I wrote and drew a whole new Simone and Ajax comic. And again, brought them back, pirate adventure, Western adventure, and published. And so this time, not only did I write and draw it for the first time, I published it. But also lately got to do I was the artist on an adaptation of George MacDonald's Fantasties, a 19th century fantasy novel that was a big inspiration on Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I got to work with one of my favorite rock stars. Anybody here hear of the original punk band The Damned? Anybody? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Captain Sensible, one of the original founding members, also had a solo career. that I always loved, and I am going to recently work with Captain Sensible on this comic book for the re-release of his 1993 solo album that had only been on CD, now coming out on vinyl in about 2 months. And this comic book that Captain Sensible and I did is going to be an insert in it. And it's like, had anybody told 14-year-old me in 1983 in Holland, Michigan, when I first discovered The Damned, that I'd be working with Captain Sensible and that the last time they came through town, he'd be coming over to my house and hanging out with me, I never could have believed it. So you never know where your art career is going to take you. You get to meet your heroes. So something, Jeffrey Brown was something I did. My next Kickstarter is going to be for this Space Girl character, Monica Moon. This is from a short story I did with her about back in 2012 that didn't actually end up going where I wanted it to go, but now, thanks to Kickstarter, I'm going to do that. And that brings us back up to Simone and HX yet again, where I did a Kickstarter for this. This is coming out soon. This book will collect all the black and white Simone and HX stories, going all the way back to that very first Loyola published Cadence story that has never been reprinted and no one outside of this school has ever seen before. So in a way, 40 years later, it all comes back full circle. Here I am at Loyola talking about the comic I did at Loyola, which I'm finally reprinting and giving out to a mass market all these years later. So anyway, I hope you've seen something here that sounded interesting. I hope I haven't rambled too incessantly. If anything sounded good, check it out. Go online, go to your local comic shop. I think isn't Third Coast just around here?
Yeah, it's actually over there. It's in the
Granada Center.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
Granada Center.
Yeah, Third Coast Comics is around here. This week is about reading comics and graphic novels. Well, every week is about reading comics and graphic novels, and I do hope you will check some of those out and read some of them, not just mine. Although if you want to read mine, I'm not going to object. So anyway, that's about it. That's what I've been doing for the last 35 years since I graduated.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. We'll hear more from you in our Q&A, but thank you. We'll hear more from you from our friends here at the Q&A, but now we'll turn it over to Scott. Thank you.
We're going to be hearing more about Andrew during my presentation, actually.
I'm everywhere.
He is every place. I'm Scott Larson. I'm a Chicago, Illinois native. I started working here at Loyola in 1988 for Beck's Bookstore, which no longer exists over here. And I started school in 1990 and finished in 97. I went part-time. I wasn't really that slow, but I did go part-time. And I actually met Andrew the first week I worked at Beck's, although he doesn't remember that, and I'm not going to bore any of you with my story on that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my art career and the Loyola influence of that. And so if you take Jocelyn, can we, with these images, I don't know if you're seeing multiple images on, or more than one page.
Seeing your art.
Okay, so so my art career actually started with me being a little kid, and when I was little, I always liked Batman, and Batman had an assistant named Robin. And as a kid, I always wanted to grow up to be Robin, which makes no sense, but as a kid, it did. And so I had created this costume, which is in the slide that you see here. And it was the first thing I ever did on my own, and it was a Robin costume. And one day my family lived in Hanover Park for a very short time. And right after we had moved there, thank you very much. And then, is this the thing does that go? Okay, gotcha. Right after we had moved there, we had lived right across the street from the school, and I walked in the back of the school, and there was some kind of thing going on. There was some kind of summer camp going on, and all these little kids were laying down, and people were tracing their bodies, and they were drawing their favorite clothes. And so I just joined in. And I laid down, and somebody drew my outline, and I drew my Robin costume, and I won first place, even though I was not part of this summer camp. And so that was July 1st, 1975. And so I always really liked comic books, and I always really liked to draw. And part of that came from my dad. my dad grew up here in Chicago as well, and he went to American Academy of Art. That's some of his artwork there. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about American Academy in a couple minutes. But when I was growing up, I was always around artwork. And so you see a couple of his paintings here. He also used to sculpt, he would build his toys and do all kinds of different things like that. So I was always around some kind of artwork, and I always knew I would do some kind of artwork. And one of the things he would do, Andrew had mentioned the comic book shop that was right around the corner. He used to drive me over to that comic book shop, hand me $2, and let me go in there and pick out anything I wanted. And you can't buy anything for $2 anymore, but at the time you could buy quite a bit. And so I spent many, many hours as a preteen in that comic book shop. And so this was the first thing I ever drew. This was my first comic strip ever. And I was going to Budlong Elementary, which is over on Foster in California. And it was the Adventures of Super Fido. And I did it with my friend Harry Capsalis, who had lived right down the block from me. And the Adventures of Super Fido was about an alien who masquerades as a dog. And he had a friend named Foolish Dan. And it wasn't turned in as an assignment, but the school actually had me do a different assignment, which I called the Amazing Anglo. And I got an E, which was excellent. So that was really my beginnings of becoming a comic book artist. I went to Amundsen High School, which is over on Damon and Foster, and they had me design the logo for the school prom. And so that's it right there. That was 1988. It was right before I started working here at Loyola. And the theme was Time of My Life, because Dirty Dancing was a movie that had come out in like 87 or something like that. And so that song was really, really, really big. And so that's what we did. And so that image ended up on the dance books and on the mugs and stuff and things of that nature. And then I came to Loyola. And so I had drawing one, which was over in the Crown Center. And I guess there are no art classes over there anymore. But my teacher was Father Eugene Geinzer, and he really encouraged us to draw from life. And so I did a self-portrait. This was January of 1991, and I also did a bunch of hands. And that picture is what the campus looked like. Actually, it's a lie. The campus, actually, the building where the basketball players are now, that was not there when I got here, but this was the oldest picture of the campus I could find. And so the building where we're standing right now was the Jesuit residence lawn, and I'm sure Peter remembers that very well. And it was, I love the school. I walked through the campus the first time and I fell in love with the school. I was working here and I decided that I needed to go to school here. Even though I was an art major and Loyola wasn't really an art school, I did find things to do. And so I moved into Mertz Hall in the fall of 1991, and I was part of the student activity board here. And the student activity board, we changed the name to Club. And so I did a logo for Club, and it was the Campus Life Union Board. And I made it look like the Superman logo because it was very comic booky. And then the next year, as soon as I was gone, they changed the logo. But they kept the name Club for quite a while, and I had these really cool souvenirs. And so I lived in Mertz Hall in room 1716, which I can actually see from here. And you can see it on that image. And this is what the campus looked like when I was living in Mertz. And so you can see that right over on Sheridan Road, there was a Wendy's, right where I guess it used to be Five Guys, but now it's like the Falafel Guys. And the CVS, that was just an empty parking lot. And I thought you guys would get a kick out of seeing those photos. So this was one of the Loyola connections that I had early on as a potential comic book artist. So I had worked for the bookstore for a while, and I ended up leaving that job. And I had gone home for the summer. I had been living in Mertz. I went back home, and I was like, okay, well, it's time to get serious. I really want to figure out what I want to do with my life. And it was like, well, I'm going to draw comics. So I started staying up late every night, drawing comics and drawing comics and drawing comics. And I went over to Larry's comic book shop, which was the place that Andrew had mentioned earlier in his presentation. And I bought Justice Society of America #1. And I was walking down the street with it, and I'm flipping through it, and I'm flipping through it, and there's this guy walking in front of me, and he keeps turning around and he's smiling, and I'm like, oh crap, who's this now? And I'm thinking, is it someone I know from the bookstore? He doesn't look familiar. And he turns around and he comes over and he starts walking towards me. He's got this big smile on his face. And he says to me, my name is Mike Parabeck, and I'm the person who drew that comic book that you're holding. And so I gasped. And I said, can you sign it? And he was going right over in the Granada Center. There was a Kinko's, and you guys probably don't know what that is anymore. But Kinko's used to do photocopies. And so he was photocopying his artwork, and he was photocopying these real comic book pages. And so I got to see the pages. And he foolishly told me where he lived. And so I wrote him a letter. And I said, hey, I'd like to show you my artwork. And so we met right over here. We went over to what used to be called the Science Library, and we sat down in the basement there, and he went through my artwork, and he was extremely nice about it. And I don't have any of that artwork here because I didn't want to embarrass myself. But he did say, he looked at me and he said, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You need a lot of work. And then we went over to his apartment, which was right down the block, and I got to see like real pages for the book that was going on for the Justice Society, and it was like super duper cool. And it was like one of those moments where you're looking at something and you kind of see the future and you kind of see the past, but you also see your hopes and dreams. And it's just like, you know, there's no better feeling than that. And Mike was very nice to give me some advice and to keep working with me up until he had passed away a few years later. I took a few more figure drawing classes here at Loyola. This is some of the stuff I did in the fall of 1993. And when I graduated in January of 1997, we had an art show, and the art show was over in the Crown Center. And I decided to do a painted story of my life. And there's an artist from Chicago named Alex Ross, and he had just done this big painted comic book about the Justice League. And I wanted to do that. And the head of the art department, who was Father Geinzer, who had shepherded me along before, very nicely looked and said, you're not ready. And he said, but you can still do the comic book of your life. And so I did. And he corrected it and corrected it and corrected it and corrected it. And I was pulling all-nighters on the weekend, and I would take it into him, and then he'd make me change the whole thing. And I remember there was a point where he was like kneeling down, looking at the stuff, and criticizing it, and I was standing behind him, and I thought, I could just kick him right now and walk out. And I chose not to do that because I didn't think I'd graduate. And so after I finished, this was the final product. And after I finished, I started working for a commercial illustration studio called Steve Edzey and Sons. And what Steve Edzey and Sons does is it does a lot of storyboards for commercials. And this is some of the artwork that I did for them. One thing is it was a publication. It was for a children's book, and it was just like rough layouts. And then underneath it were storyboards for Crayola crayons. And I had done, back then we were not working digitally yet, and so I drew those and then I colored them in with markers. And then here's our friend Andrew Pepoy. And right around the same time I started working for Steve Edzey. One of the things that I need to mention is when I was going to Loyola and I talked about comic books, the person people talked about over and over and over was Andrew Pepoy. Everybody knew Andrew. And then the
3-colored 6-inch high spiky hair, so it was hard.
well, it wasn't that. It was the fact that he really liked comic books, and so people talked about Andrew, and he talked about the Cadence magazine earlier. I had that, and that came out right about the time that I had moved out of Mertz, and so I had torn the pages out and I had them hanging over my drawing board for about a year. So I was very, very, very familiar with his work. So this is the first thing I ever did for him. So I was Andrew's assistant, and what that meant was I got to color in all the black areas of the pages. So he would hand me these pages where he had done the inking and he had done the outlining, and then he had like the teeny weeny little X's where we were supposed to, or I was supposed to color it in, and I had to stay true to all the line work, which I didn't, and he ended up changing it. And lecturing me a little bit about it. But he was really good, and he invited me back, and I helped him out for a couple of years. So this was from a book called Mutant X, and I did 2 pages for him, and it was something that was very, very, very exciting for me because they were real pages, and I was also working on real storyboards at the same time. And then right around that point, one of the things that I found as an artist is it never ends. If you want to be an artist or you want to be a creative person, any kind of creative person, learning never ends. No matter how much education you have, no matter how many hours you put in, there's always something to learn. There's always something to do. There's always something different that is presented to you. So I went back to school. And I had a pretty long Loyola career. And one of the things that happens when you graduate from undergrad is you're like, I'm done with that. I'm never going back. And I found out like almost immediately that I had to go back. So this is some of the artwork I did at American Academy of Art. American Academy of Art literally closed 6 months ago. And the school was 101 years old. My dad went there. It had turned out a whole lot of commercial illustrators and comic book illustrators, and the person who designed the Santa Claus for the Coke commercial back in the 50s, he went there. And so this is some of the work that I did there, and there was certainly some figure drawing. I had some illustration classes, which I didn't really have here at Loyola. Everything at Loyola was figure drawing or design. And then near the end of my time there, I started painting. And I mentioned earlier that I wanted to do the painted story of my life, and I was told that I wasn't ready. And Father Gonza was completely correct. I had no clue what I was doing. And there are things I picked up at the academy, and there are things I picked up at the art studio. And so at the bottom here, there's a painting of somebody flying. That was a comic book that I had created at the academy. And I went back when I graduated, and I showed the teacher the stuff I did at Loyola, and I said, look, I want to redo this. I always wanted to do it as a painted story of my life. And so he said, go for it. And because I had worked on storyboards and because I had done some paintings, I was able to do it, and I was able to do it in the way that I wanted to do it. So that is, it's much different than the earlier one, and I did get to put Loyola in there, which was fun. And it was a really, really, really interesting experience. And then about a year after that, actually thanks to Andrew here, I ended up getting the first professional comic job I had ever done, and it was for a company called Capstone Press. And it was a biography of Marie Curie. So it was Marie Curie and Radioactivity. And I did, so just to back up, when it comes to comic books, Andrew talked about how he wanted to draw comics and how he ended up becoming an inker. And so comic books, for anyone who doesn't know, is an assembly line. And in general, not always. Sometimes there's someone who does it all. But in general, there is a writer. There's a penciler. There's an inker, a colorist, a letterer, and then an editor who's supposed to put it all together. And I always saw myself as a penciler. And so with Marie Curie, I was penciler and the colorist. And so the first image you see there after the cover is my thumbnails. So anytime you work on a piece of artwork, it generally helps, and I think that Stephen will probably back me up on this, that you do what's called a thumbnail or a rough. And it gives you a roadmap. It's not always the final of where you're going to go. It gives you a roadmap of where you want to go. And so right underneath it was my pencils. And I do my pencils super duper tight because I didn't want any mystery for whoever was going to be inking it. And then below it is the inks that were done by a friend named Mark Heike. and my coloring for the book. And then from there, I did a whole bunch of other things. I got to do a King Kong story, which was really interesting for a company called Markosia, which is based in England, and it was called Kong, King of Skull Island, and it was really interesting because what happened was they had an artist, and then the artist dropped out, and they said, "Well, can you do issue 3 and 5? It was a 5-issue series, so it's basically sometimes there's ongoing series like with Batman and like." Batman's up to like number 950 now, but sometimes there are different comic books which will only go for 5 issues, and this was 5 issues. So the guy who was running the company, the guy named Harry Marcos, he said, "Can you do issue 3 and issue 5?" And I said, "Yeah." And so I did the pencils for issue 3, and then I sat on it. I sent it to him, and then I waited and waited and waited. And like a month or so afterwards, he was like, "Oh, hey, I got the pencils. Yeah, we're Sam T. Inker, and we're running into a little of a problem. Can you do half of number 5 or number 4?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, I can do that." He's like, "Can you have it done next week?" And when you're an artist, one of the things, and especially a freelance artist, you never say no. So of course I said, "Of course I can do it." And then he said, "Yeah." And then 2 weeks after that, we need number 5 done too, and you're going to do the whole thing of that. And so I did, and it was super duper rough and super awful looking. And he came back and he said, "Well, we're going to put these in a collection, much like Andrew's collection, and it's called, it's a graphic novel." And so he said, "Well, what we could do is, can you redraw it all?" And I said, "Of course I can redraw it all," because I wanted to. I didn't want anyone to see the stuff I had done. And so I did. I redrew it, and that's a page from the redraws. And then I worked for a company called AC Comics, and they do a book called Femforce. And that's what the next image is. And then I worked on a comic called The Saint. Does anyone know what The Saint is? Peter, do you remember The Saint? So The Saint, for anyone who doesn't know, was an old-time radio show. It was a TV show, and it was a movie starring who is now the late Val Kilmer back in 1997, right around the time I graduated from Loyola. I also did a book called Victoria's Secret Service, and I did a series, a couple pages of a series called 1,000 Ways to Die, which was also based on a TV show. It was some kind of reality show. I never saw it. And so they had me draw a couple stories, and then after I drew the stories, I saw what they actually filmed, and I was like, "Oh, my artwork's way better than that." And one of the things that I started running into problems with, and I had mentioned it before, that comic books are an assembly line. And no offense to anybody who comes across after anyone else in the assembly line. And Andrew was never really my stuff, so I'm not talking about him. Yeah, well, you did a couple covers though. I mean, it's not the same thing. That doesn't go into what I'm about to say. So one of the things that ends up happening is, I would do the pencils, and then someone else would come along and ink it, and then someone else would come along to color it, and someone would come along to letter it. And what I found was that somewhere along the line, across the assembly line, is that somebody would destroy my artwork. And sometimes it was the inker, sometimes it was the colorist, and oddly enough, the letterer did it a couple times. And I have no clue how that happened. To this day, I'm dumbfounded by that. And they would have, they put like the balloons on top of someone's face, or, it was just one of those things. And I really wanted to do something on my own, but I'm not a writer. And I didn't really want to ink, and I don't want to be forced into coloring, but I really wanted to do something on my own. And so one day I found out that I had some ancestors that were buried in Graceland Cemetery here in Chicago. Does anyone know Graceland Cemetery? Has anyone been in Graceland Cemetery? Peter, did you see anything when you were anything spooky when you were in Graceland Cemetery?
Not spooked me, but intrigued me.
Okay. One of the things that happened, I'll tell you about that in a second. So I walked through Graceland Cemetery to find my ancestors' graves, and there were no tombstones for them. So I kind of had a general sense of where they were. And I walked in, and the first thing I saw was this cloaked figure who actually looks like the Spectre character from DC Comics, which was like, ooh, comic books. And it was such a weird image. And apparently he's got a haunted story where you look into his face and you see a vision of your own death. I don't know if that's true or not because I was too afraid to do it. And I walked through the cemetery, and of course there's like some kind of creepy little girl in a glass case, and there were all kinds of strange things. And I went to bed one night, and I woke up, and I had this really weird dream. And it was this dream about somebody running around through a cemetery. And so I decided that I was going to draw it out. And that's what these little thumbnails are. And I thought, okay, well, this is God telling me that I should be doing this story. And I thought about it, and I'm like, well, what do I want to do? I'm not a horror fan. I don't like ghosts. I don't care about that stuff. But I know skulls sell, so of course that's probably not a bad thing to have. And I thought, well, you know what? I love Chicago, and I love history. When I was here at Loyola, I majored in art and I minored in history and psychology. And so history is something that I always really, really enjoyed. And so I thought, you know, I could do the history of Chicago and make it a superhero story and make the superheroes this stuff that I saw in this dream. And so, so I came up with my book. So here's the images that I came up with. And these images were basically kind of sort of what my dream was like. And if you go back, and you can see on the left here, there is like a little boy playing a flute, and there's like a hand coming out of a grave, and you see like this weird head. That's what this is. So this is what the thumbnails kind of evolved into. And for anybody who knows Graceland Cemetery, there's a lot of different Graceland iconography in here. So the little boy with a flute is based on a monument in Graceland Cemetery. The little girl behind him was the creepy little girl in the glass. The angel is in Graceland Cemetery. The specter or kind of figure is in Graceland Cemetery. And the last image there was someone breaking out of a tomb. The image is actually based on a real monument, and the monument is in France someplace, and it's a body crashing out of a tomb. And I thought that that was such an interesting image. I wanted to put it into the book, and so that's actually Potter Palmer's tomb he's breaking out of. And so I decided to call the book Visitations. And so Visitations is the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. It starts at the turn of the characters are like a Ghost Justice League, and Justice League, for anyone who doesn't know, or Avengers are superhero teams. And they have adventures. They're all based on real monuments in different cemeteries around the world. They have adventures while history grows and changes in the background. It starts at the turn of the century, and it will go to present day or however long I live. I don't know what ending is coming first. And so I decided, that's actually the last slide, I decided that if I was going to do this, I was going to do it in a way that nobody had ever done before. One of the things when it comes to comic books is Andrew mentioned that he had won an Eisner Award. Will Eisner was, he had started out doing comics at the dawn of the comic book industry. And he had always felt that comic books could be more than they actually are. That it wasn't just superheroes, that they could tell a whole range of different stories and a whole range of different things could happen in them. And it's a flat printed page. And and in that flat printed page, there are many, many different things you can do. In traditional comics, it's basically panel, 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 panel. Sorry, panel, 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 next page, panel, 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 next page. And so I wanted to do something really, really, really different. So, so I'm going to show you real quick what I'm doing. So, so the first issue, which is this one right here, is it's an introduction to the characters. The second issue I decided that I saw this really cool graphic novel about World War One, and the book was, you pulled it out and it was like a gigantic map of World War One, and it would go basically from that side of the room all the way over to that side. And I thought, I want to do that, and there was no way I could do that because I couldn't afford to do it. And so what I decided to do instead was I decided to do all double page spreads, and whoever is reading it is required to move it around and around and around. The third issue is a point of view story, so whoever is reading it is the main character. And the story actually starts out over by Marshall Field's downtown, or as the kids might know it, Macy's. And people walk over and they talk to the main character. It deals with the beginnings of organized crime in Chicago. And organized crime started with gambling and houses of prostitution. And so the main character ends up going to a very bad place and he sees murders, or she sees murders. The fourth issue, I talked about Alex Ross and I talked about the painted stuff. And so I wanted to do what he did and I failed miserably at it. However, I did do a painted story. And I decided that I wanted to go the extra mile. And so the book itself comes with a link to a downloadable audio file, which is the same story told from a different perspective in the style of a 1940s radio show. So I have actors playing the parts, and there's like music and a commercial in there. The fifth issue I have is a couple different comic strips. Andrew was talking earlier about the comic strips that he was doing, that he had done Little Orphan Annie. And so I have it as, I did a comedy comic strip, and I don't know how many people can see that. And I did an adventure strip, and then it comes together in the middle, and it becomes one story, and the characters go to the World's Fair of 1893 here in Chicago. The sixth issue is told in newspaper headlines. The seventh issue is a flip book, and on one side it continues the story that started in number 6. On the other side, it's the origin of one of the characters, and he meets Barack Obama the day before the 2008 election. 8 is a gigantic battle in the cemetery. And number 9, which I did give copies to Jocelyn, but they haven't been bound yet. Number 9, I revealed who the villain is. But I didn't want anyone to just be able to look at the last page and see. So I have it as a connect the dots. So people have to work to find out who the villain is. Andrew, when you were reading comics as a kid, would you go to the last page to find out how it ended? Oh, I always did. So I wanted to make sure that no one could be like me. So that's my artistic journey, and a big part of that artistic journey started here at Loyola. When I was a senior here and I was doing my comic book story of my life, they had us write an essay, and there were a couple of different books. One was Will Eisner's book, and another was done by a guy named Scott McCloud. Scott McCloud basically did this comic book about the philosophy of comics. And the thing about Loyola that I enjoyed was it wasn't just the artwork, it was also everything that branched out from that. Andrew talked about having a physics class. I liked my history classes. And they made us take an art history class here at Loyola. And I took the history of modern art. And I'm a traditionalist. So, I took one look at that and I was like, oh, this is stupid. Why am I looking at this? There was one, when we were doing the test, there was a slide and I thought the teacher forgot to put the slide in. As it turns out, it was a piece called White on White. And so I got that wrong on the test. But the thing was, and especially reading Scott McCloud's book, I saw the benefit of modern art, the modern art I learned here at Loyola University, and how it could fit in with my comic book stuff. And so my feeling, my feeling as a creator, and my feeling as an alumni is that every experience you have in your life will add on to whatever it is you want to do. And whether it's comic books or whether it's writing or whether it's anything, we build on these experiences and we continue to grow and we continue to grow. And Loyola was a wonderful place for me because I got to start my growth journey here. And I'll never forget my time here. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Now we'll call Stephen in. Thank you.
Well, I'm always intrigued by the biography of who artists and creative people are, and if it wasn't late, I would ask each one of you a couple of questions. So I'll presume something without being presumptuous. I presume that you have a creative heart and spirit, and perhaps some talent, God-given, in my opinion, developed over a long time to become an artist. Human beings have made ordinary life beautiful from the beginning by making ordinary things artistic and beautiful. We beat on hollow logs to drum for dances. We put costumes on, makeup. We've carved statues of our ancestors, of our future. We've made representations of the unrepresentable. We've made life spiritual when it isn't, tangibly speaking. Artists serve a very powerful role in human development from the beginning of time. From the beginning of time. Before written history, even the oral tradition, which became the storytelling, was artistic, it was poetic, it was beautiful. And to me, Carl Sandburg's line from his poem about Harvest Moon says it better than anything else. He says, love asks the beautiful, unanswerable questions. And to me, that's what artists, writers, painters, musicians, dancers, of all stripes do. And I've been on the planet a lot longer than all of you put together. When I started here at Loyola, there was no art department. When I was a sophomore, I was a literature major, and I loved it, and I came out of a very high-tech kind of high school program that was so-called honors program that wanted math and science so we could compete with the world for space. And arts were being neglected. And when I was a sophomore, I went to the dean and I said, I think, even though I had a full scholarship here, I thought I would transfer to some place where I could find out if I had any artistic ability. And he said, wait, before you do that, let me talk to the head of the art department at Mundelein College. And I said, but Father Krolakowski, I said, but that's an all-women's school. He said, you have a problem with that? I said, well, no. So he talked to the head of the department, Sister Blanche Marie Gallagher. We had an interview. I found out that she was not only a painter, but a musician and a writer and a philosopher. And I realized for the first time in my life that you could explore lots of things with a creative, open mind. She was willing to accept me as the first male student at Mundelein. So I finished my degree in English literature here. I got 33 studio hours of art at Mundelein and essentially a degree from there. And it was the time when the world was crazy as it is now. And by almost fate, or in my sensibility, grace, that put me in the right place at the right time. That meeting with Father Krolikowski was absolutely grace-filled to send me there. When I was here at school, there were lots of people who had big influences on me. I was also a musician and was in a very popular rock and roll band, which ended up recording albums. I ended up having a musical career as well. But the visual art part of me was still nagging, did I have the ability? But when I graduated, Vietnam was active. I needed to do something morally. I wasn't sure what. And it turns out that, again, by divine chance or fate or serendipitous virtue, quality, I found out 5 days before I was to be inducted in the military that teachers were still being given deferments. And so I went downtown to the Archdiocese of Chicago, and I met with somebody there, and I said, I have no education courses. I was a double major of literature and art. I don't believe morally that I can go to Vietnam. I understand that teachers are still being given deferments. What are the chances that you could hire me? And he said, I can't believe this happened. I got a call 10 minutes before you came saying they needed an art teacher at a school on the west side. Would you be willing to teach? I said, I guess. Little kids? And he said, yeah. Because having a degree from Loyola in those days meant you had as many philosophy and theology courses as your major. So I hadn't talked to a little kid since I was a little kid. And I went down for that interview. They sent me to the school. I met with the principal and the priest who was the pastor, and they said after the interview, we think we'd like to hire you because our new mission for the school is to be a non-graded kind of interdisciplinary educational system that's being tried out in a lot of parts of the country, and the Archdiocese has given us the okay to do this. Anyway, I did. I taught for a few years. I felt compelled to go back to education. I went back to the Art Institute as a painter. While I was there, I did a lot of freelance work for the Goodman Theater, posters and advertising design. I got recruited by the National Endowment for the Arts program to be an artist in residence because of somebody I met who was already in the program who got me the interview. I ended up doing over 110 residencies all over the country in a multidisciplinary way of music, art, and creative writing. And in the meantime, I was trying to pursue a commercial effort at making art. And fortunately, my working with little kids at that school on the west side started me writing a lot of kids' songs, which I performed with them and we did together. And then a friend of mine from Loyola, Frank Hogan, who was ultimately on board of trustees, he was a manager for my musical band career before that. And anyway, he introduced me to a publisher who then agreed to publish a songbook of music and illustrations that I did. That led to meeting other people in the publishing world. I ended up doing probably 15 to 20 children's books. That led me to do work with some adult publishers, especially in religious ed. On the table over there, there are about 100 duplicate things, copies of all sorts of stuff. I ended up doing, based on writing a piece about Father Titus Brandsma, a Carmelite who was killed in the concentration camp in 43 or 4. The Carmelites commissioned me to do a portrait, which then took me to Rome for the beatification. The painting is there in the Vatican. I ended up taking any job that came along, no matter what it was, because if I didn't know how to do it, I would teach myself or find somebody, a colleague who could teach me to do it. I painted portraits of winning racehorses for Arlington Racetrack for 7 years on porcelain. I had never really drawn a horse before in my life, and I'd never painted on porcelain. I ended up buying a kiln. I made over 110, I think, trophies, some of which, million race back when Arlington track was open before they sold it to Churchill Downs. So every time there was something that piqued my interest, or I met someone who said, "We've got this thing, can you do that?" And I would say, like to your point, never say no, especially if there's a deadline or time. Last summer, no, 2 summers ago, I gold leafed a huge cross ornament on top of a chapel from a forklift that I had to operate, a high lift thing that I ran myself, because when I went there to get the thing, a guy came and said, "Well, here's what you do," and he left. So, I'm up in this thing down at West Jackson Boulevard for Mercy Home, gold leafing, because I had learned how to gold leaf doing icons for the church. Anyway, ended up doing and Father Garanzini was president here, commissioned me to do 20 portraits of past presidents, deans, that sort of thing. After seeing some of the other work I had done, I've ended up painting over 60 formal oil portraits. And I feel like it's grace that you asked me to come and do this, because frankly, I had forgotten a lot of those things that I did, forgotten about them. I went through file drawers and boxes just because I thought it would be fascinating to me. And literally have made several thousand paintings, some of which are huge, that took 6 weeks to do, or little kids stuff, little things. Doing Sister Jean's portrait was one of the honors of my life. That's over in the. So all these things about, if you have a creative heart and a creative spirit, and it's what God made you for, it's your incumbent responsibility to do it, and to push yourself late night hours, working all the way around the clock sometimes to meet a deadline, or just following a passionate sense of what art does for the human spirit, not only for yourself but for the viewers. I in all those residencies, artist residency programs I did through the National Endowment, I would tell the kids, whether they were kindergartners or college age kids, I would say, look, art is simple. There are 3 things. You get an idea, you make it real somehow, whatever it is, a dance, a piece of music, a painting, a piece of writing, whatever. You have to take your idea and make it real. And then it's absolutely incumbent upon you to share it with somebody else. And I had kids come to me in tears and say, "You take my artwork," after a month or 3 weeks out of school. And I'd say, "Why?" And they'd say, "Because if I take it home, my parents will just throw it away." And it's heartbreaking to realize how so few people value, even though it has to be known in the heart, it has to be known how important art expression is for a society and a culture. We'll remember paintings from the Renaissance long after people have forgotten what the Medicis did in terms of politics, but we know that they commissioned some great people to make some great art. By the way, that statue of Laredo Taft, the shrouded guy, one of my favorite sculptors. When I was a Boy Scout, we hiked along the Rock River, and far up north there's a statue of Chief Blackhawk. That's monumental that he did too. Anyway, so art connects to every human being, whether they realize it or not. And I treasured what Loyola did for me because it gave me this broad sense of philosophy, thinking about the classic Greeks saying, look, life unexamined is not worth living. Think about that. Life unexamined is not worth living. And the fact that there are so many people doing so many different things that collectively speaks beyond anything any one of us individually can do. And I treasure what Loyola did by all the connections that it's like this string on a musical instrument that's, that artists are responsible for keeping tuned from the beginning of time to now and into the future, that without us keeping some tension and tuning on the musical note of our heart, all the rest of it's for nothing. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think I've met a lot of famous artists, a lot of people who've done amazing things in a long life of making stuff, musically and visual art people, and people who are great writers. I talk about Cadence. I did some of the first drawings for Cadence when Stuart Dybek was, who famous writer from Loyola, had his first work published. And Pete, a lifelong friend like Peter, who's my son's godfather and has been just a dear friend. And Marianne and Jocelyn, thanks for this kind of, I just wish that people could hear from artists about why this is important. And I know there are a lot of practical things about being an artist that are unrealistic. 1.6% of Americans declared their job on the tax form as artists. That's in 11 categories: art, music, dance, theater, directing, all of that. 1.6%. So it's not easy, it's not practical to be an artist, because sometimes it's great fun, great reward. Sometimes you wonder if you should have done something else. My father was a skilled carpenter, but he always said, gotta have something to fall back on. And my parents, and family, a lot of people, a lot of friends over the years were wonderful in that support and served to be the muse, and to be the supporter too. Like in Odysseus, in the classic tale, the term mentor comes from a character in the Greek story of Ulysses. Mentor was the guy who said to Ulysses, I believe in you more than you believe in yourself. And now we use that term as a personage who supports us, but that's where it comes from. And other thing Odysseus said was, at the end, I'm a part of all that I've encountered, and all that I've encountered is now part of me. And if we don't live a life that's examined and we learn the virtues, and I still think Aristotle was right, that it's all down to truth, beauty, and goodness. And those are not relative terms. Those are absolutes, not defined by any one of our perceptions or our individual point of view. Those abstracts are, in my mind, the bottom line. And thanks for asking.
Thank you very much. I feel very honored, and as a fellow alum, so I graduated from Loyola, so as a fellow alum, thank you so much. It is an inspiration to hear your stories, and I want you to know too that we're recording this so that we can also share it with more students, faculty, and staff who can't be here today. So I will have this opportunity to more people could hear you.
This is our Lady of the Universe. Please take one or a couple. It's a painting I did for LUREC, Loyola's campus at the 7-foot.
Yes. So thank you. So we'll take anyone,
Yep.
everyone can please take samples, and I know all of you would have your work here too that we can come up and take a look and we can talk to you more.
Scott and I both brought books. If anybody's interested in purchasing, Scott and I both have copies of our work that are you can buy here today if you want. Take them home and read them for National Library. You know.
And also, one of the things that I do, and kind of more of a marketing thing than anything else, is I tell people when I go to different venues and I'm selling my book that if they want to sign up for it, I always send out a free digital copy of the first issue of my book because I want people to read it. I want people to like it. You know, like Stephen said, one of the things about artwork is not just, you know, doing it, but also seeing what the reaction is and seeing how people feel about it. And I think all of our artwork, everybody sitting at this table, you know, it's something that is important to all of us, and it is something that comes from inside, and it is our responsibility to share it with everybody. So, you know, feel free, and please feel free to take a look at the stuff that's over on the table.
So we'll open it up for questions. I want to start then.
And does anyone mind while we're taking questions if I go grab that chocolate chip cookie that's calling me?
Please, yes. Start, Peter.
Well, I just want to thank the panel for all your insights and all your information. I think in the last hour I learned more about comic books than I ever knew in my entire life. So thank you for that. And as far as Stephen's ode to beauty, truth, and goodness, thank you. Nothing I haven't heard before having coffee with you in coffee houses and places like that. But this whole emphasis on comic books from Andrew and Scott made me think back to my own childhood. In the late 40s and early 50s, that's 1940s and 50s, just for the record. Comic books were under suspicion for two reasons. One is that if teachers caught you with a comic book, that wasn't serious education. And a lot of them thought that you were wasting your time reading comic books. That was one problem. But the other problem is it was during the McCarthy era and the House on Un-American Activities Committee that were finding communists under every teacup, especially in places like comic books. And there was a whole idea connected with McCarthyism that comic books were at least rotting the brains of our American youth and at most turning them into communists. And those are dark times, and we live in dark times today, I believe. And I'm just wondering how you view your work. I'm not calling you communists, obviously, and I think what you do is a real wonderful extension of truth, goodness, and beauty. But given the dark times that we seem to be living in today, do you see any problems with people misjudging your work?
I mean, you know, people are looking to misjudge things in general these days. So I mean, I'm sure things will be misjudged. But one thing that occurred to me while you were talking about that is, you know, like I was telling our reporter friend here earlier. I mean, for me, in a way, I'm trying to battle these dark times by bringing some laughter into people's lives. But I'm not necessarily, you know, like things don't necessarily have to have a big overarching message. They can, and I've done things with big messages. But I've looked at it. I was just saying that, like, you know, I do this. This is a very silly comic book. It's not deep and meaningful. I always say to people, if you're looking for anything deep and meaningful, this is not it. And I'm doing my own little battle with the dark times, hoping that I can just give some people some smiles, make them laugh at a really bad joke, and hate themselves for doing so. And I had a point, and now I've forgotten what that point was. I do that. Anyway, Scott looked like they had something to say, so I'll give him his microphone in a second. But I'll just say, yeah, I mean, you're right. It is dark times, and we're all doing our best to manage in these dark times. And like I said, my way of managing it and hoping other people can manage it is to make them smile and give them something light and fun and ridiculous and silly, just, you know, to take them away from, you know, tariffs and things like that.
Peter, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a really good question, and you know, it can be tough. I was talking about the stuff that I'm doing, and one of the books deals with the what was the levee district in Chicago, which basically deals with human trafficking. And that one was very hard for me to work on, and it's been hard for me to market, for lack of a better way to put it. And I know that I was in Indiana recently, and for a comic book convention there, and there was like this 10-year-old kid who saw the cover and really wanted the book. And it was one of those times I actively tried to talk a parent out of buying something of mine, but I made super duper clear that they knew what it was about, because there's some real rough stuff in there. And I took the parent through every single page. I'm like, this is what's happening here. This is what's happening here. And it's not so much the dirtiness of the subject, but the crime itself, and the way human nature can be. You know, Peter, you said that these are dark times. Every time is dark for somebody, and there isn't any time on the face of this earth that hasn't been dark for somebody. And you know, it's like times are always tough. You know, and I think that sometimes we forget about that. The other thing is the flip book that I have, the one with Obama in it. It's also a issue that deals with homosexuality and the prejudices against it. And you know, I found myself in various places. I mentioned that I was in Indianapolis, and I walked around that city, and I saw what was spray painted on some of those cars. And so I kind of flipped that one over and wasn't really broadcasting that aspect of it. And it is something that I get concerned about a little bit, because you don't know who you're dealing with, and you don't know how they, you know, what view of the world there is that they have. Um, but the fact of the matter is, some of this stuff is just, it's a part of life the way it is. And I think that when it comes to the comic book stuff, people know that in general. You know, they know that, you know, for example, homosexuality is out there, or human trafficking is out there, and a whole slew of other things. And I think as long as you're addressing the situation in a respectful way, and you're showing, you know, the heart or the intention behind it, as opposed to just showing the stuff that someone would find offensive, then you're okay. You know, there's no real good answer to that question. I haven't been confronted with anything yet. And I do wonder if someday I will, and what my answer would be.
I think it's the nature of provoking places where people don't normally go, or advocating, that my Latin background sometimes comes to classical Latin when I think about the word provoke, advoke, invoke, convoke, and convocation. All those evoking, the eliciting, the. I think the artist has an obligation to entertain, to amuse, to instruct, to provoke, to advoke, to all of those things are part of what artists are supposed to do. I had some great advice from a person a long time ago at the Art Institute, a painting teacher, who said, you be careful that you don't get too attached to what your intent of your work is for others. For yourself, yes, but for others, you are not in control of their response to your work. You can try to be, it's like propaganda art from tyrannical times back in history through the current day. A lot of artwork has been used to propagandize. The church has certainly used it. All churches have. Every political persuasion has tried to influence people through artwork and music. And what is current is not necessarily what will be or what was. And I don't think that, some artists are provocateurs, and that's what they want to do, and that's great. I as I said, making art is as individual as anyone who ever calls himself a creative. But the advice that if you think about the audience before you think about your intent to make it, then maybe your timeline is a little out of order. Authors, well, any creative person, I think, should think about the work, their intent, their heart, their proselytizing of their idea, but expectations and the end result is not up to you, not up to the artist. History will decide, others will decide. I told kids when they were worried about their parents throwing their artwork away, I would say, look, someday, somewhere, somehow, someone will appreciate what you've done. Someday, somewhere, someone will. How many? Who knows? Even one is worth doing.
Any other questions?
I'll pass the microphone.
As the only student remaining in the audience and being among one of many broke college students, what would your perspective be on the economic side of things? Because as much as I agree with you, one cannot live on passion alone.
No, that was a question put to me, and since I've lived longest of anyone who's here, I've been blessed beyond measure with the grace of the universe. But I also think I work really hard at a lot of things for a lot of venues and people. And I almost always put the same amount of effort into it, whether it's a little kid's book that's in Spanish and English about the animal protection thing in Vieques, Puerto Rico, or a primary reader from a publishing company, as much as, maybe not as much as painting Sister Jean, but and people, the economics is always hard because how does one even set a price? People who, kids, especially high school or college kids, who would ask me about how to make a living, I would say two things. You need to get some. And when I was at the Art Institute, there was not a class on how to do your taxes or be a business person as an artist. That's ridiculous. It's a professional school. And there is now maybe, but in the 70s there wasn't. And art has always been seen, the creative thing is this kind of outsider personality, they'll always be there. So practically speaking, I would say that prepare yourself as much as possible. Hone your skills, because like I said before, people get ideas, but if you don't have the skill with which to be articulate, you will not be able to communicate the ideas very well. And if you can communicate your ideas, like you said, going to a publisher, standing in a hall, and somebody serendipitously being there to look or to listen to you, to answer, put yourself in a position to be graced by the universe. I think it's possible. It sounds, I know it sounds less than practical advice, but all I can say is that the more you put yourself out there, the more skillful you are. I had advice from a publisher early on who said, you do too many things. Do one thing really well. You'll never be a success just trying to do everything. But I tried to think about that. I couldn't give up playing music. I've been a member of the Musicians Union for 50 years. I recorded albums, I played soundtracks, I've written about 400 pieces of music. I couldn't give up writing because Loyola's literature department made me love written word. And certainly I've been drawing since I was a child, and always, when a Dominican nun in third grade pat you on the head and said, you draw better than anybody I know. When an adult says that to you, you put that in a special place in your heart and you keep it forever. So if you truly feel the vocation, not as a job, but as a calling, a vocation, maybe I'm a naive optimist like my mother was, but I believe with all my heart that if you follow a passion that is deeply embedded in your heart, somehow it will work. There were lots of times when I thought it would never work. And then all of a sudden, it did. And then it didn't, and then it did. That's the hardest part, is putting up with the ebb and flow of reality. But artists don't live in the real world, as you probably know. So don't give up, but 1.6% put artists on their tax form. That comes from the Bureau of Statistics, not from me. So I don't know, just work really hard at it. Put yourself in every situation you could possibly think of that might be a benefit. There was, last thing I'll say, in a book I read when I was probably 20, it was advice to an artist written in about 1820 for the French Academy. The advice from the teacher was, go to every exhibit, every museum, every opportunity, look at everything, do it. Just keep going, looking. And then one day when you realize you know what you're going to do, stop going and go to the studio and paint. I don't think it's quite that clear cut, but there is some good advice about that, because you could be a dilettante and go forever of going to every exhibit and never doing any of your own work.
You wanted to know about the economics. I guess this one's as far as the economics go. Yeah, it's not going to be easy. He talked about being in the right place at the right time. Yeah, you just have to get yourself out there, no matter where, just all over the place. I've been doing this professionally 35 years. I'm still out there hustling. I'm still standing in portfolio lines. What kind of art are you doing?
I'm in a painting class right now, but I try and do a bit of everything.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, doing a bit of everything. I mean, I've had someone look at my portfolio, and I've had people who've seen the good side and the bad side of the comment I've gotten of it. Looks like there's 13 different artists in this portfolio. Be flexible, be open to trying different things, but most of all, hustle and be out there. He mentioned taxes. Keep really good records. Save every receipt, and because you'd be amazed what you can deduct. Um, find yourself a good accountant. That's also the other another thing I will say. Yes, because I've seen many artists who go out there, start making a few bucks, and then get themselves into massive tax trouble, like I did when I was young and straight out of school, and ended up owing the IRS like $10,000 I didn't have. So keep really good records and get yourself a good accountant.
There's one other suggestion that I think is good, and that is try to put yourself into a community that has some experienced people who have done things in the arts. There's a lot of great advice from people who are very willing to be mentors, if possible, to professional artists. Look at the connection between these two, that your career might not have happened had it not been.
Oh, no, it would have happened.
Well, but not in the way it did. Right?
No, definitely not.
No. So and that kind of
Probably would have
It's
been
never
far
gonna
better
be-
had he never met me.
never going to be a straight line either. It's
Can Jake, right?
Yeah.
So, Jake, when I started self-publishing my book, one of the things that people do right now is they do like Kickstarters or crowdfunders or whatever. And I decided that I didn't want to do that because I didn't like the idea of just asking people for money. I figured that if I could do my work and I could get people interested in it, they would buy it. And if worse came to worse, I would draw it on typing paper or photocopy paper. I guess there's no such thing as typing anymore. And I would find a way to get it out there. The economics is something that is always present. But just because it's always present doesn't mean that you always have to worry about it. One of the things that I find when I go to these comic book conventions is there is a virus that goes from person to person, table to table at these conventions. And the virus is, I'm not making enough money. This is a slow convention. I'm not going to make table. I made table. Oh, this was a good convention because I can pay for my hotel room. And on and on and on. I was just in Washington, D.C. And these people behind me, they were selling these like stuffed animal things, and I walked in on Sunday morning, and I was like, "Oh, good morning" to one of the people behind me, and I'm like, "Well, good luck today," and she just said, "Oh, today's gonna be terrible," and I said, "Well, why?" "Well, yesterday was terrible." And I said, "Well, let's try and be positive here." And she's like, "Well, I'm positive today's going to suck." And it was one of those things where I looked at her and I thought, yeah, it is, because you've taken that attitude. The money thing is always going to be there. There's going to be times when you extend yourself too much, and there's going to be times when you have money rolling in. And there's no rhyme or reason to any of that. And sometimes you're going to have to spend money you don't have. And that's the reality. And it's not anything that, one of the things that's probably pounded into your head as a student at Loyola is your tuition bills. Your tuition is so high. Oh my God, it's so high. I remember when they raised tuition in 1989 and people walked into the bookstore and they were like, oh my God, how am I going to pay for this? This is never going to work out. And on and on and on. And those people all graduated from here and it all worked out one way or the other. Just because the money issue is there, just because you might have to spend more than you have, just because you might have to go into debt or you might not, doesn't mean that that should affect your work. Your work is the most important thing. The money is ever present. And I'm going to be honest, I made the mistake. And that's why I can say this. I made the mistake before the pandemic. I went right before the pandemic hit. Um, C2E2, which is the convention that's going on this weekend at McCormick Place, it was going on. It went on like literally a week and a half before everything shut down, and I did the best I had ever done at a convention at that point. But all I thought was, well, it's not enough. I haven't made enough. How am I going to need? How am I going to get money for this trip? How am I going to get money for that? And I realized throughout the course of the convention, and especially when everything shut down. And we were put into this position where nobody, people were working because of the internet. But the fact of the matter is, the government was going to come and take our houses away because they shut everything down. And when I looked at that, I realized that the economics, even though they're always going to be there, they're man-made, and you can work with that in whatever way you choose to. But it's not like, Jesus didn't float down from heaven and say, you have to pay this much in order to become an artist. That's just not the way it works. And so your art should always come first. And the money stuff, you will find a way to pay for it one way or the other. And so that should not be your primary goal.
Yeah, and there's one thing we haven't talked about is representation or an agent. And I've had both the experience of a great representative and a terrible one who stole money, who the contract said one thing and the reality was something else. I've done stuff on my own. I've done stuff through friends, through word of mouth. There is no formula. I know a painter who pays in New York to have their work exhibited at a gallery. Pays up front, but they ask much more than he would be willing to ask on his own. So if they sell something of his, he does fine. But otherwise, it's like a gambling risk almost. He's betting that his work will sell. That way everybody wins. But if it doesn't, the gallery still wins. I know songwriters who have been stolen from by signing an agreement that gave away their publishing rights. There are clubs that the performers have to pay the club to play on the premise that it's going to be good business. They would be able to sell their, on iTunes or CDs or whatever, long ancient things like records, Although I just recently did album covers these last 2 years for a current artist, old school LPs with lovely gatefolds and lots of roof illustration and a booklet in one of them, drawings. So there are people still, small niche again, but if you find what makes your heart feel right, trust that. But the business has never been good for artists. Never. People, it never had. So don't have that expectation. But if you can find somebody who will help you, do that. Don't give up because you're relying entirely on yourself. Because your job as an artist is to make the art, not to do the business of it. Unfortunately, we're sort of stuck with that self-promotion, that kind of thing. It's tricky, but it's reality. But it again, I trust that the universe knows what it's doing, and I don't.
Well, the other thing too is with some of this stuff, there's no rhyme or reason to it. And Stephen talked about his friend who pays the gallery up front, and I'm sure there are times that friend does extremely well, and then I'm sure there are times that they don't sell anything.
Right.
And that happens, and that even happens in our world where we go to these conventions, and there's no guarantee. And there's no guarantee that one year will be better than the other or that it will be less than the other. And it's just, it's like shooting dice. But that's part of the game. That's just part of the whole experience.
What kind of work do you do?
I'm doing mostly painting right now. Oil painting.
What kind of historic period would you put yourself in? I mean, are you a traditionalist, a modernist, an abstraction? Where?
I'm not aiming for anything in particular, but I take a lot of inspiration from like the early 20th century, like American illustrators.
Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyatt, people like that. Those were my favorite people growing up because my aunt and uncle had a collection of all the classic Robin Hood and King Arthur, the Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth. That whole family. I don't know if you know that, but Howard Pyle taught N.C. Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth taught his son Andrew Wyeth. Andrew Wyeth taught his son Jamie Wyeth. The only one still living, and he's an older man. And before that, there was all the way back to Albert Dürer. You could trace this kind of tradition of that sort of style, which I emulated in some of my pen and ink drawings because I was just so taken with those as a kid. And the more I look at modern art sometimes that I don't understand, but I want to know why someone put all that effort into it. And so I try to be as open as possible to as many variables as I can without abandoning my own principle. And the only advice I think really from a practical sense, like you say, that there is no rhyme or reason. And I cannot tell you how many fabulously talented people I've met in my life who have not succeeded practically, financially. People who have given up after long attempts. And it breaks my heart because some of those people were just fabulously talented. Writers, musicians, painters.
To ask another question then, how do you, sort of maintain like motivation and creativity and so that uncertainty?
It comes and goes. There's an ebb and a flow to that as well. Oh, sorry. There's an ebb and a flow to that as well. So there are times when you get inspired, and then there are times when you're just kind of grinding it out, or there are times when you're watching TV.
This is working? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this ties in with the economics. Sometimes creativity comes because you have a mortgage to pay. And you just sort of like, I've got to do it. And I'm going to have to come up with something. And it's going to have to be good enough. And you put it out there. And generally you're like, I don't know, at least for myself, I would put it out there and think, well, this really sucks. But you put it out there and somebody thinks it's good enough to actually pay you for. Yeah, the creativity. I mean, there are days like I will once in a great while have one of these creative days where I will be able to write down the notes for an entire new idea, like a whole new series. And my notebook will be filled with several pages of little tiny notes, and it all comes to me like in one day. And I wish I had those kinds of ideas every day, and this only happens once every few years. So some days they are like that. People just have the creativity, and other days it's just sort of like, well, I have to make something because I don't know, like I said, I guess maybe I'm the most practical of all of us up here in some ways, where it's just sort of like I have bills to pay, and so therefore I must create, and that, you know, whatever your reasons, you know, some days it comes, some days it doesn't, but you know, something will make you, you know, will prompt you to do it, and you'll find your own reason on those days when you don't really want to create, that will make you want, you know, that will make you sit down still with a brush and your canvas and whatever you're working with and make something anyway. And you might look at it and go, well, that kind of sucks, but you still made something.
There was a story that that I have about Andrew from a few years ago, and actually from a very long time ago, where he said to me, you know, if work dries up, I'm still gonna work on stuff, and if I have to go work at the Gap in order to pay my bills, I'll do that. And so, you know, going back to where the money is gonna come from someplace, it will. But with creativity, I think that it can be hard sometimes, you know. And we all have the crazy artist gene as well, and you know, we tend to be a little bit more emotional in different directions, and that expresses itself in different people in different ways.
I guess I was talking, you know, you'll keep creating even with some of these other things. Like I came right off my 18 years on The Simpsons to nothing, no work, and had no money coming in. I applied for a job at a bank. I almost ended up taking it, but fortunately some other work came along. But you know, you just, you know, this ties into your economics thing. You know, you'll the economics and the creativity. You'll find a way to make both happen somehow. You don't know what it is, and I know it sounds like, you know, we're all saying the same thing. You'll find a way to make it happen. You're like, but how? How do I do this? What's the magic code? There isn't one. But you know, if you really want to do it, you know, you will find a way to balance out both the creativity and the economics, and somehow survive. And you know, you're gonna have your good years and your bad years. Like I said, when I was working on The Simpsons, I didn't get rich, but I made a decent living. Um, and I had years where I was doing Simpsons and Fables, and I made a little bit better than a decent living. And then now you know, and then, like I said, but then, you know, you have your times where you think, oh, I just did 18 years of The Simpsons. Everyone's going to want to hire me, and then nobody does, and then you question everything that you ever just did. But you find, but again, as we've all been saying, you find a way, and you just keep plowing through, and you know, you sit there and you look at your work, and you say, it all sucks. At least that's what I do all the time. But yet you remain slightly delusional and think, but somebody should pay me for this. And you just keep going, and you just keep going. You know, Scots are. How many times have I told you the business is dying and I'm not going to have anything to do?
Every time I've talked to you for the past 30 years.
Yeah, and yet I am still doing comics. I have not taken the job at the bank. I've not taken the job at the Gap. I'm not above doing that though. You know, it's like if I had to do that to keep doing comics on the side, comics are what calls me, and I will keep doing comics, and I'll find a way to make it happen one way or the other.
And the other thing that happens too, I mean, we're going down a dark path here. You know, Peter was talking about dark times, but I think that you've kind of brought that to a whole new level, Jake. Where you know, there is, you know, speaking of dark, there's a thing called the dark night of the soul, and it's one of those moments that we all go through in life where everything we've done looks like it's collapsed underneath our feet, and that is when you're living with the crazy artist gene, that makes it that much harder, I think, to deal with. But what ends up happening is something comes to shake you up out of it. And for me, it was the pandemic. I mean, my life before the pandemic and my life during the pandemic were completely different. And it was, I think, you know, you talk about your inspiration. I got more inspired during the pandemic than I was for like 2 years before that. And it's just something that happens, you know, and it's just, you know, your inspiration, your creativity, and your economics, and all of this stuff kind of swirls around you all the time. It's almost like, you know, if you could see it invisibly, and it's really a matter of keeping your focus on what you're doing. And I think that's harder now than ever because in addition to this stuff, you're also dealing with like all the social media stuff and all the political stuff and all the stuff that demands your attention, and just keeping your eye on the ball, keep looking forward is extremely difficult. But that's part of becoming a successful creative person too.
I'm just going to mention it's about 6:30 and we're about half hour over time, so we probably need to wrap this up.
Have another. You have some last word for, I'm not final. We'll still have-
No, I think just for me, the sense of if one believes that you have been gifted and you've worked hard to develop the gift, because kids used to say to me a lot in those residencies, God, I'd do anything to be able to draw like you. And I would say, but I've been drawing longer than you've been alive, more hours. I have literally spent sometimes 80 hours, 100 hours a week working on something to finish it for a deadline. And none of it matters. All it matters is doing it. Philosophically, there's the difference between being and doing. Jacques Maritain, the French Jesuit philosopher, I go back to that book a lot on the distinction between being and doing. And it's the difference between a job and a vocation. And it's the difference between being a creative human spirit and not. It's a spiritual thing. It is practical. I mean, and impractical to be an artist, no question. Always has been, probably always will be. The whole AI thing now is a world that, you know, for me, an electric pencil sharpener is probably what my high tech is, although I've done graphic stuff on computer. But it's the tools change, the heart doesn't change from the beginning. And it hopefully never will. If you believe that it's worth doing, then just, to quote Nike, do it. Just do it.
Well, you know, thanks for coming,
Yeah,
and
thank
thank
you.
you for being the lone student to stick around to the very bitter end.
And we have had students who said thank you, but they had to go. But we will reconnect. But I think what we could all share and appreciate is the community that you bring, and connecting with our students, faculty and staff, and the members of the Loyola neighborhood and community. So thank you so much for gracing us with your time and talent.
Thanks, everybody.
And we will hear more from you. So this won't be the last. Thank you. And we have some parting gifts. All of you, on behalf of the libraries, and Marianne Ryan, she's coming. She's coming.
Yes. And I just want to, very loud. I just want to add my thanks to all of you. Peter said it before, I learned more about comic books tonight than I've known my entire life. Stephen did as well. On a kind of practical level, though, I have to say, Andrew, so Simone, I'm seeing Taylor Swift there. Has anybody ever commented on the resemblance? Well, she does, but
created in 1989.
you know, but maybe you were channeling that, or maybe it's just that I see Taylor Swift everywhere now, and so that's why I see her in that. But anyway, it was just a great evening and a great panel. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. And I will also say that, yes, you pointed out that we're a half hour overtime. Today's my daughter's birthday, and I told her that I would be there no later than 6, and so I'm going to have help to pay tonight. So anyway, but it was well worth it. Thank you. No, that's all on me. I couldn't tear myself away, so that tells you to deal with the wrath of my daughter is worth it to be here. So thank you.
Thank you.